Welcome to the PFP podcast. My name is Ian Simons, Content and Capabilities Director at the CII and lead for the PFS Sustainable Financial Advice Panel. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two practitioner members to talk about a new paradigm in financial planning, Alan Whittle and Sebastian Elwell. Seb is Director of Switchfoot Wealth and a Solar Advisory Board member and Chair of STEP Surrey, as well as being a member of the PFS Sustainable Financial Advice Panel and author of the PFS Sustainable Financial Advice Methodology. Hi, Seb.
Good morning.
And Alan Whittle is Director of Unburdened, as well as an academic at Manchester Metropolitan University, co-author of various CII training courses, including the ESG Sustainable Finance Spotlight, and, of course, a member of the PFS Sustainable Financial Advice Panel. Hi, Alan.
Good morning, Ian.
So there's a lot that I'm excited to talk through this morning, not least some exciting new research that you've been doing, Alan. But first, can I ask, Seb, you've been leading in sustainable finance for a long time now, and I wondered if maybe you could give us a positive history of how you first got into that position and how you've evolved into where you are now.
Yeah, sure. So I think I've always been aware of sustainability issues. I've got a BSc as my undergraduate degree, so I sort of understand the scientific method, and I've always had a sort of a broad interest in a range of things. I've had a subscription to New Scientist since I was a kid. And so that's always been there in the background, but I didn't connect it with my work to begin with. I was a financial advisor doing everything the way that everyone always did it. Until I think when I founded Switchfoot Wealth, when I got that going, I took the decision that actually we needed to default to sustainable investments because that aligned with the way that most of my clients actually thought about it. I think there's FCA research from the Financial Lives Survey, which will quote something like 80% of people expect their money to do good and avoid harms, or I think it might have been 76% in the latest round of that. But consistently, most of our clients do care about sustainability issues. And I felt it increasingly incongruous that we defaulted to traditional investing with sustainability presented as the outlier choice. And so we flipped that to be, well, we default to sustainable and then we present unsustainable or irresponsible investment as the moral outlier choice. And that went down very, very well with our clients. But what that started to highlight over time was an inconsistency in the financial planning process. And so that opened up a can of worms for me, which I think we'll talk about on this podcast today, that sticking sustainable investment solutions on the back of a process that was invented for another purpose revealed some logical inconsistencies, and that kicked off a whole area of interest and research for me.
A can of worms, an area of interest, all opportunities and challenges. And this morning, I think we're looking at it as a paradigm shift. So I think that's a perfect place for us to kick off. So if I'm going to come to you, Alan, as I mentioned in the intro, you have a rich academic history to this, as well as a practitioner lens. Which would you say you use primarily on this subject?
I've always tried to bring the practitioner and academic together. I think that the practitioner community needs to learn from the academic community, and the academic community needs to learn from practitioners. So I've always tried to bring the two together, whether that's in the work that I'm doing with firms or with the PFS or in my teaching. I've always tried to bring the two together to make the real world come into the academic circle, and to bring some of that theory from the academic understanding of sustainability and its relationship with finance into what we do with clients in the real world.
Really interesting. It comes back to some of what Seb was touching on earlier as well, about the sort of the relationship between what is driving client expectations and needs and some of the stats that might be driving both behaviors as well as the facts or science behind climate change. Some of this is academic in the sense that there are facts and there are data that can be used for it, and some of it is about skill, the coaching, the planning expertise that helps bring those things together. So perhaps if we can go straight into the detail then. Alan, you've been doing a lot of recent research into this. I wonder if you could give us a bit of an overview of what that research tells us and potentially what we might be able to use it with. As we said, it informs practice as well as then practice informing academia. If you can tell us a bit about what the research is telling us.
Absolutely. So I'm going to try very hard not to bore you with 3 years worth of research that I did for my PhD, and highlight some of the key areas in that. Otherwise, we'll be here for 6 or 7 hours, and I don't think anyone's got the stamina for that. For me, there were certain questions that I wanted to answer when I was starting out my research. I just spent a year looking at people's motivations for investing in responsible and ethical investments in general and trying to understand that. And so when I went into my research for my thesis, it came with that background of looking at things in a perspective where people are saying, "Oh, this is important to me. These things are important to me," and we have these areas of importance to each of us. And I wanted to understand that in a bit more detail. I wanted to understand how these things that are important to people, affected their decision making, how they make decisions around financial products, and how advisors interact with that, whether the advisor can influence or does influence the way in which people think. So I started by looking at traditional economics. I started looking at economic models and how they can tell us about how people make decisions, looking at a lot of behavioral economic theory from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and various others, and understanding how people's perception of the world influences how they behave, how they make decisions, and particularly how they see risk and things like that. What I wanted to do is take some of that and think about it with a completely different lens. So instead of thinking about it with a financial lens, which is the traditional way of doing it, I decided to apply a non-financial lens to it. So let's look at the non-financial outcomes, the things that people want to get out of investing and their financial lives, which are not measured in pounds and pence, things which are non-financial, the non-financial outcomes. And that might be environmental, it might be social, it might be something which is very important to them that doesn't necessarily have a financial value, but has a value to them as an individual. So in the process of uncovering that, I also found that there were two really interesting areas that came out of it. One was the language that we use when we're talking about sustainability and when we talk about financial products and so on. So the influence of language, how advisors and the language that they use, how that can influence the way in which people make decisions, how they think about investing and so on. And what it also uncovered was this fascinating thing that Seb's already hinted at, which is a change in paradigm in the way that we think about sustainability in terms of financial products. So like any scientific theory, we have a paradigm which is in place at any given time. So the paradigm for financial advice, shall we say, was once around product sales and selling a product to a client. Then it moved from that product sales paradigm into a more holistic financial planning approach. So thinking more about the needs of the individual and bringing cash flow modeling into that and making sure that we're thinking about the long-term financial security of an individual or a family. And then what I'm seeing, what the research uncovered, was people like Seb who are trying to change the paradigm again, where we have sustainability at the core of the financial planning process and how that changes our approaches, not just to client interaction, but to the way in which we model the future and the way that we think about risk and the way that we think about sustainability risk in a financial services context. So that's one of the most enjoyable parts of it. I love the language side of the research. I love how we can look at the language that people use and see how they're using that intentionally or otherwise to influence their clients or to help understand their clients. It's what I call shared landscapes of meaning. So we create these shared landscapes of meaning with clients because we're talking about things from our own individual perspectives. And so that's one area that I find absolutely fascinating, but also this idea that we are at the point of this emerging paradigm where sustainability becomes the core or integrated into the financial planning process in a way that it wasn't before. So in the same way that Thomas Kuhn talked about the structure of scientific revolutions and the overthrow of the paradigm, we're at that stage where we have this emerging paradigm in financial planning, and that I hope will overthrow the existing paradigm that doesn't necessarily have sustainability at the core of the financial planning process.
It's fascinating. I love the concept of a shared landscape of meaning. And if I don't know if I take this in the same way that it was intended, but I picture immediately in my mind, obviously, a landscape. And on that landscape, you can visualize various things. And you can imagine in the very old-fashioned paradigm where I'm coming to a financial advisor to help me choose between various options. And I might come there, then on my horizon, I've got three options. I want to do this with my pension. I want to do that with my ISA or whatever. And I'm asking them for their advice on which of those to do. And then turning that into a landscape where it can broaden out the horizon and perhaps have more of a dialogue where you're saying, actually, you have some needs that you might not have been aware of that might not be a product solution, or you might have values that need to be explored further. You both sort of almost paint a bigger picture of that landscape or visualize that horizon expanding and saying, actually, let's start with your values and then look at what else needs to be on that landscape. As I say, that may well not be what you had in mind, but the picture in me was then visualizing something rather than it being a set of options on a menu to being something that have an ever-expanding horizon of opportunity, but with the client at the heart of it.
I think the point about a shared landscape is really interesting because clients come in with assumptions about what they're expecting and advisors come in with assumptions. And sometimes we don't fully understand each other. So taking it from a later life advice perspective, there's a very common narrative that climate change or sustainability is something that young people are interested in and old people less so. And that's patently untrue. Older people invented organizations like Greenpeace. They were radical in their day, but they often have a very different language for how they talk about that. So older people, this is stereotypically, but it is true. If you sat down in a client meeting with them, at the table, just outside the window, there's a bird feeder, and you know what? They're fantastic at naming the species of birds that turn up. They've got a longer baseline to look back over nature loss. They won't understand necessarily, I mean, some will, but not all of them will understand the language of carbon accounting. If you talk to them about CO2e or scope 1, 2, 3 emissions or ESG, you're just talking straight over the head. They never learnt about this stuff at school. It wasn't how they thought. It wasn't how they talked to each other. But if you talk to them about pollution, then actually you've helped the advisor and the client walk into that shared landscape of meaning, because that's something that they understand very, very well. And so if we're talking, we might be talking about the same thing, but if we've got different language and we don't recognize each other's language and how we might respond to that, then there's no shared meaning and you can't get to the core of the problem.
So what you've both done is you've used metaphor to describe how you perceive what we're talking about in terms of these shared landscapes of meaning, which is exactly what I was uncovering in the research. So each advisor, each client that I spoke to used their own metaphors. Sometimes they had drawn on the so sometimes clients had drawn on the metaphors of their advisors. So an advisor had introduced a particular metaphor into a conversation, and the client had accepted that, and that was now the way that they understood something. So when we are trying to communicate something which is internal, we can use metaphor to try and explain that to somebody else with words that they understand. So Seb, you used the client and the bird feeder. So I'm immediately visualizing the client looking out at the window at the birds and maybe wondering why there aren't as many songbirds as there once were. You used an imagery landscape, and that's your way of thinking about it, but you used that metaphor to convey your understanding to us. And so we do this without thinking about it a lot of the time. It's a really interesting and can be quite challenging way of thinking about things, because if you're not thinking about the words that you use, you may use words that influence people. So I was having a lovely conversation on Friday with somebody who used constructing metaphors all the time in the discussion that they were having with me. One of the ones that we find very regularly in finance, particularly in financial planning, is the use of the journey metaphor. And we're on a journey together, and sometimes financial planners are seen as navigators or they're planning the route for a client on a shared journey together. But some of these metaphors can fall down. They can create expectations and things as well. So we have to be really careful about how we use language, because it can help create that connection between people, but it can also, like I said, set expectations or set an understanding which might not be quite what you want it to be. It might create a dependency on one perspective in that time.
That's really fascinating, and particularly as a non-practitioner, but from my experience with financial advice and financial planning is sometimes I feel like I want to be in the driving seat and I think I know what I want, and sometimes I'm looking for that guidance, and not being clear between the two parties in there about either the language that's being used that might be unwittingly being influenced by the language, whether that's a metaphor or whether it's literally this person is giving me three options and I think I'm expecting a fourth one, whatever it might be. There's that sort of a shared language. There's a process that needs to be sort of agreed or understood. I think one of the key things that's coming through from a lot of what's talked about is there are conventional ways of following that process, and then there are potentially other ways that start in a different place, and that maybe has a greater focus on shared language, shared understanding, expectations, rather than on perhaps some of the more conventional process flows. I wonder if Seb, perhaps, if you can outline what, if we do achieve the paradigm shift you're talking about, which we'll explore more in future in the next few questions. But when we've achieved this paradigm shift, what do you think the key change will look like? What will success look like from both the client's point of view and from a financial advisor's point of view?
So I don't think that the paradigm shift is going to be a final paradigm shift. It's an interim step towards something. What that something is far too far beyond our current understanding to know what the shape of it is going to be. But the world is not sustainable at the moment. That's very, very clear that we are breaching planetary boundaries. We're also undershooting basic societal requirements in terms of well-being for people. And I don't know what a sustainable society is going to end up looking like. I know it's a journey that we have to go on, using your journey metaphor, but I don't know what the destination looks like. But I feel like I do know what the next step is. And once we've completed that step, maybe we'll have a better understanding of the next step that we need to take. So, to give you an example, how do we either entirely decouple growth from consumption of material resources? Or how do we build a financial planning environment that doesn't allow for growth? How does a defined benefit pension scheme work when there is no growth? Because we don't have a choice. We're breaching planetary boundaries. So one of two things is going to happen. We're going to bring the economy back within planetary boundaries, or nature is going to destroy us because we're just powering up the Earth systems, and the Earth systems are far more powerful than we are. So I don't know what a sustainable society looks like, but I do know what an interim step that helps us get there it is. And that interim step is really, I think, about the stories that we tell each other. I don't think the major power of financial planning in terms of building that sustainable society is actually the investment decisions that we make. They're somewhat important. The power is in people understanding their role within the financial system and understanding a little bit more about the impacts of the world on people. I think people understand things very easily at the scale of a household. How will the climate crisis affect me? How will it affect my children? How will it affect my parents? This summer I was very worried about my parents, actually, because they're now, I'm not going to say they're elderly, they won't like that, but they are, or heading that way. And they've retired out to their dream in northern France in a little rural property. But they've had many, many days where the heat has been above 38 degrees and the nighttime temperatures have been, well above 20 degrees, days and days and days in a row. And they don't have air conditioning. And those sorts of temperatures are deadly. So sustainable financial planning for them is recognizing, well, that's not going to stop. That's only going to get worse. Even if we cut all greenhouse gas emissions now, it's going to take time for the planet to reach equilibrium, and that temperature will continue to rise for the rest of my financial plan and the rest of their financial plan. So they need to adapt to that. And so I'm imploring them to say, look, spending a few £100 or a few £1,000 on some air conditioning units, that's a financial decision. And it's a financial decision that I want them to make, and they're being tight and it's all right, our house is a bit cool. I'm thinking, well, the alternative is, well, what happens if you end up having a stroke and you end up in a care home? Because, gosh, that, aside from the personal devastation, just applying a financial lens to that, that's pretty devastating for your financial plan. And so these are financial decisions, and they're financial decisions recognizing the impact of climate, but they're not in any way related to the sale of a financial product. They impact financial products because, well, we need to think about the timing of withdrawals. We need to think about appropriate cash reserves. And so there's many, many ways in which the world will impact us far more than our impact on the world is. But our impact on the world is still important. And it's bringing that perspective of what is going to happen to the world and what is a realistic vision of the future that is science informed. And that's where I got to the logical inconsistencies in the process. So when you describe the logic of investing sustainably, it's because, well, the economy is going to have to shift at some point, or everyone dies. So those are the two outcomes we got at the moment. There'll be a rapid transition towards a sustainable economy, or we get utterly destroyed by climate. The Institute and Factory of Actuaries have put a 90% likelihood of extreme to catastrophic climate risk this side of 2050 on our current trajectory. So that's more than half the world dead. That's the financial system gone. There will be no financial planning in that world. That's our current trajectory. So that's unacceptable. That's obviously unacceptable. So we have to transition. There's a point to financial planning in a hothouse world. So if we're going to transition, we might as well invest sustainably now. That might lead to differential performance and all of the rest of it. So that's an investment logic that people can easily understand. But then you look back at your financial planning process and your cash flow modelling, and your cash flow modelling is just showing 6% a year return on equity investment, irrespective of what happens to the climate. And that's just, I was going to say it's naive. I think we've gone past the point of it being naive, because the actuaries have issued numerous risk warnings, written numerous returns. It's now looking like willful ignorance, and that's unethical. So for me, that breaches, I'm bound by the Solar Code of Ethics, I'm bound by the PFS Code of Ethics, I'm bound by the STEP Code of Ethics. And all of them have some concept of act with honesty, integrity, and all of them have some concept of act with skill and due diligence. I think those are core principles to professional advice, and not just financial advisors. That applies to lawyers and accountants and tax advisors. They all say be honest, and they all say be competent. And if we're showing people projections into the future that are scientifically implausible, then we're not being honest with our clients, and we're not helping them understand how they're going to need to adapt. But if we help them understand, then they have huge power that they take out into the rest of their lives.
That's really fascinating, particularly the juxtaposition between the sort of human story of your parents and the cold, hard academic research by the IFOA. That, that's a report I've read, and the numbers sort of stick, but what do they mean to me? Do they feel believable? It's so fundamental that you go, actually, I need some human context to put this in, which is where you need both of those things to come together. So the stories of how will that materialize in my parents' lives or whatever. So you go from a world where you're thinking, I'm starting with the numbers and thinking, how might this investment progress over a period of time? And you get, that's one lens, but then you've got the story or the impact of those numbers in how it will be felt by people, and making sure that's something that you're able to engage clients in that conversation on both those levels. So my own feeling is we've been looking at stats and data and evidence and theories, etc., for a long time. That hasn't changed everything fast enough. So if it's stories that help change that, how do we get more people having those stories, and how do we make that a better connection? Alan, I know obviously with all the research you've done, have you got any thoughts on who else we need to be having these conversations with? How do we generate more of these stories? How do they fit within the financial planning process to actually make this shift in a positive way that actually leads to better client outcomes?
I think from a financial planning perspective, we need to understand the importance of narrative. So Seb's been talking about narrative control. If you listen to one story and that's the only thing that you listen to, and you keep saying the same thing, it doesn't necessarily make it true. You need to bring in that academic evidence. You need to bring in an understanding of what's really going on in the world. And I think the point that Seb's made about the IFOA is really important, that there's this research out there that's saying this is a really important issue. This is going to have an impact on our lives. It's going to have an impact on financial outcomes as well as non-financial outcomes. So we need to start listening to these perspectives and incorporating them into how we talk about people's financial futures. There's a brilliant piece of writing which talks about man as humankind as a storyteller, that we communicate best through telling stories. We communicate. So Seb's story of family and the importance of family in those financial decisions. One of the people that I interviewed for one piece of research hadn't thought about the issue of sustainability connected to finance at all until he had children for the first time. When he had children, suddenly it changed his perspective. He was starting to think about whether or not this was the type of world he wanted his children to grow up in. We've got people talking about the challenges of not even wanting to bring children into this world because of the fear of what we're handing over to them. So I think from a narrative perspective, we need to bring things into that personal level and help people understand it, understand climate risk, understand it from a personal perspective. Are you going to be able to insure your property? Is your property in a place where it's going to be at risk from catastrophic flooding or increasingly inclement weather, or as Seb was saying, hot house scenarios? Just even in the sort of the short to medium term. That's not even long term thinking. So I think we need to understand that. I think as financial planners, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves around the risks and the considered scientific data that exists around what is going to happen if we don't bring things into a more sustainable paradigm. And then we need to bring that into client conversations. There's a challenge as to whether or not we are, we don't want to be scaring people, but we want to be educating them. We are controlling the narrative. Financial planners control the narrative. They are the navigators. They are the people who are being turned to for advice. So that gives a greater responsibility on the financial advisor to have an understanding of these issues and the impact that they will have on people's financial lives, because people are coming to you for advice. So you need to be in a position where you've educated yourself as to where that's coming from, and then you can bring that into the conversations. I'm not entirely sure I've answered your question.
I think you have, actually. Well, I mean, I think my question sort of evolved a bit into the direction you were talking anyway, which is sort of how do we achieve that change? And I think you explained around expanding on the telling stories, and I think the area I'd be interested to explore with Seb, given your experience of delivering this through Switchfoot Wealth, is the difference in, if I say, a more conventional financial advice process, and how I understand you bring in this approach, and picking up on the point that Alan just shared there around our job isn't to scare people, but it is to educate. If the education is in itself scary, that might be
It's a difficult thing to manage. Yeah. Yeah.
Do I want to scare my client? No, that's not a good thing. I want that as an outcome isn't ideal. Is it necessary as part of education? And going back to stories, some of the best stories are scary stories. Maybe that's important. It's an important part of engaging people.
Oh, we love horror stories as a species, don't we?
We do, but do we love scary?
No. So the practical way that I find actually works with clients is it's going back to that point about assumptions. So principle one of sustainable financial planning is use realistic assumptions about the future, but recognize a concept called model risk. So the financial plan is a financial model. It's not an attempt to describe reality. It's an attempt to simplify and project a possible future that is inevitably going to be wrong. So if you know from day one that every assumption that you put into that plan is going to be wrong, it's going to be reasoned, and it needs to be a reasonable assumption, but it's not going to accurately predict the future, then why do we generally only use one set of assumptions? So I would tend to say, here's a set of assumptions that are reasonable if we are in a high heating scenario, and here's an entirely different set of assumptions for if we're in a rapid transition scenario. And then let's compare and contrast. So it's not just having one set of assumptions which you then stress test. It's not doing stochastic modeling, because you can run your stress tests on either assumption set A or assumption set B or assumption set C. And so it's building off the back of credible narrative scenarios. So taking, I was inspired by narrative scenario analysis. The IPCC have the shared socio-economic pathways. So when science is projecting into the future, they have a whole range of socio and economic assumptions that shift depending whether we're talking about SSP1 through to SSP5, a rapid transition up to a high heating scenario. I know, so we should be doing that with financial planning. And then if you show your clients, look, we might be on a high heating scenario, and you as an individual, you can do something to influence it, but the world is going to have a bigger impact on you. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try and influence it. So here's how your financial future looks in a high heating scenario or in a low heating scenario. And by the way, a high heating scenario is devastating. We are amortizing everything down to zero, by about 2050. Are you happy with that? No, but it's a reasoned and reasonable assumption. But financial planning has nothing to say about what to do in that scenario. That breaches the boundaries of financial planning. Another plausible scenario is a rapid transition scenario, and we can, at least in part, make that a little bit more likely to happen. And so we can show various plausible futures and allow the client to choose, well, actually, I'd quite like to align my finances with that plausible future. And then they can direct their capital, they can direct their life, they can direct their lifestyle. And even in the most optimistic future scenarios, there are going to be significant impacts. And we need to help our clients adapt to those impacts. Some countries in Europe have strategic food reserves. The UK doesn't. The UK government actually tells people, you should make sure that you have sufficient food to last you a few months in the event of a crisis. Maybe that's an idea that should come into financial planning if you're doing budgeting. In order to have because we don't have a national strategic food reserve, in order to have a personal strategic food reserve, I have dried beans and pastas and things like that, and I have sufficient food that I think, I could get by for a few months, and then we're in big trouble, but I could get by for a few months, and that helps smooth things a bit. But I've got the privilege of having enough cupboard space, enough spare room in my house. Not everybody has that. I've got enough budget in my financial plan. That there is always a top up going on there. So because government isn't doing it for us, it's going to be an unequal thing. But the more that we can do as individuals to make ourselves more resilient, the easier it is for the rest of society. Because if we're meeting our own needs, there's going to be people that fall through the net that we're going to have to help collectively. That's going to be the role of government. So there's the future's a scary place, but just because it's a scary place, we can't just pretend it's not. That doesn't sit right either. But we can show people it's a scary place. Here's what some possible and likely impacts might be. Here's how you might think about adapting yourself to that. And here's how you can invest, and here's something positive that you can do. So what we're actually doing is we're describing that scary future, but we're also empowering our clients. And what terrifies people is when they have no control and they can't see how they fit into the system. Whereas actually, if you can show people things that you can do and show people how they can step into the power that they have, then that's a positive thing.
I'd like to just pick up on one of the things that you were talking about there in terms of we've talked a couple of times about willful blindness, and that is something which is very apparent in paradigm shifts. So when you have a substantial paradigm shift, you might find that there are people who simply refuse to acknowledge the reality which has been exposed by new information. The best example of that I can think of is the introduction of plate tectonics. So up until that point, we had different theories around how the Earth was formed. You had expanding Earth theory and things like that. And then somebody came along with a new theory of plate tectonics. And at certain points, universities were teaching both the new paradigm and they were teaching the old paradigm as well, because they didn't know which of those paradigms was going to take place. We've seen the same thing with physics, the difference between Newtonian and Einsteinian physics, and then that has in itself been overturned, but not necessarily in such a dramatic fashion as plate tectonics overruling previous types of geological theory. Geology is a great place for looking for paradigm shifts, because it's one of those areas where when they've discovered something that has fundamentally changed our understanding. So the age of the Earth and things like that has been massively changed. And there are some brilliant examples of how that is a way that one paradigm has eventually overruled the assumptions of the previous paradigm. So back to assumptions again, I think. So if we are to embrace this as a new paradigm of financial planning, then our assumptions need to change. And there will be those who don't want to accept those assumptions, this changing way of looking at things. And those that do, then they may have to have there may be friction between those who are embracing that new paradigm and those who are denying its potential to better explain what we should be doing in a financial planning sense.
That's really interesting, and particularly makes me wonder what we must do as a professional body, PFS and CII, to help make that transition. So providing more information, more guidance might convince those who are already convinced of that. So take some of those other paradigm shifts. I'm not an academic, but you look through the history of whether it was evolution, and you get waves of different angles coming at it. Is it providing more education, more information that changes perception and increases adoption of that, or normalizes that, it becomes their paradigm? Or is it something else? What else could we do? There's a lot that you do with the CI and the PFS personally, Alan, in terms of providing training materials. Is it more of that? Is it what is it that we could be doing more of?
So you use the word normalizing. So you need to make something the norm. So it is the I think there's an obligation on the PFS CII to provide the information. There's already information there, but I think it's not the responsibility of the PFS to say you must. It is to provide that education piece that we've been talking about, to provide access to the materials, to encourage the broadening of horizons and understanding, and to look at it and say, if you don't educate yourself on this, even if you choose to take a position which is contrary to this particular paradigm, if you do so without educating yourself, then you may well not be acting in your client's best interests. And I think that's the important thing, is that we can talk about this from a risk perspective, from insurance risk perspective or something like that. You don't have insurance companies that are saying, yeah, we're not going to insure these businesses because they are at extreme risk from climate, and then going and investing their money with those businesses, because that would be an element. There'll be an element of cognitive dissonance in that, which is just mind blowing. So we need to have that educational role, and I think that's a really important thing. It's to provide access to the information to allow financial planners to make an informed choice as to how they are going to set up their own assumptions. And if they choose to ignore that, then they choose to ignore that, but they then have to face the consequences, whether that is in terms of their clients turning around in 5 or 10 years' time and saying, why didn't you warn me about this? Or their own conscience in terms of how they have influenced the outcomes that we will see in 10 or 15 years' time.
I'd like to say it's worth taking a systemic view and thinking about the financial planning system, and thinking about what is our role, or what are our roles within that financial planning system. And you can think about an individual advisor. What is their role? What is theirs to do in this paradigm shift? You can think about a firm. You can think about us as a profession, the role of professional bodies and regulators, and you can think about enabling support services like technology providers. And we all have different roles in that system, and we also have different levels of agency and power and influence within that system. So it's worth thinking about, well, what is my role? What is within my sphere of concern? What are the things that I worry about? What is within my sphere of influence? And what is within my sphere of control? And depending on your role in the system, you'll have very, very different answers. And so what you should do is, first of all, concentrate on what is within your sphere of control, and then focus attention on what is within your sphere of influence, and try and not worry too much about what is within your sphere of concern. So your sphere of concern, yeah, I'm terrified about climate change, right? But that could take me down the route of planting seagrass. It could take me down the route of putting solar panels on my house. All of these things are great things to do, but within our system, I'm first and foremost a financial planner. So that is directly within my sphere of control, how I do financial planning. What's within my sphere of influence? Well, I can phone up Voyant and Cash Calc and IntelliFlow Planning and all of the other cash flow tools and say, Do you know what? It is impossible to model multiple assumption sets that take account of climate breakdown within your tool. Your tool's not fit for purpose. And they largely ignore me. But if enough of us keep phoning them up and telling them that, then eventually they'll say, oh yeah, we'll just change a bit of code and bang, the system will be able to do it. And once the system is able to do it, then we'll all be able to do it and it will become a normal thing. So that's a very long answer to your question.
It's a really interesting one. And if I could just be devil's advocate a bit and challenge one aspect of the sphere of influence versus broader concerns, but there is always an argument that you could say, in the current world as it currently is, not in the future, if I prioritize, if my client wishes to prioritize a financial return in the short term, it is not in my sphere of control that I can change that some asset classes that might not be sustainable might be a better financial return for them. How do you square that circle with a client that may be saying, look, I just want that financial return. I don't want to be talking about this nonsense. I just want to make more money. Thank you very much. Stick it in this area.
Different people will have to come to their own answer to that.
Right.
I'm not going to participate in the destruction of my family. So if somebody I want to invest in an oil company. If they say, I want to invest in an oil company because I want to invest with a manager that is going to use stewardship and engagement, I'll help them. If they say, I want to go into an oil company and I don't want any of this engagement nonsense, I want to get as much fossil fuel out of the ground to maximize my profit, I won't help them. Because by helping them, I'm destroying my own future. That's a stupid thing to do. They can go and find another advisor.
I think this is one of the areas where the PFS can really help, is give clients the opportunity to self-select an advisor. So we find that so far, those who have the greatest interest in investing or planning for a better future are congregating together. So Seb might work with people who, I think you said at the beginning, are this is the way that they were thinking. And they were your clients were people who were open to discussing this with you. And there will be advisors who think the opposite of Seb, whose clients may associate with them. I think the important thing that the PFS has to do is that wider public awareness that this is available, because sometimes people don't know how much of an influence their finances have on the environment and on sustainability, and the influence that the environment and sustainability have on their finances. And so there's that sphere of influence thing. As individuals, we might not have a huge sphere of influence, but as a professional body, the PFS may have the opportunity to create public education on these issues and say, well, actually, this is something that your advisor might not have talked to you about, or you might want to talk to your advisor about, is what is the sustainability risk that is inherent in my investment strategy, or how sustainable are the providers that I'm using for my investments? Because people have a tendency to think about, and I'm making a crass generalization here, so apologies, but they have a tendency to think about their finances as somebody else's problem. That's why they employ a financial advisor, a financial planner, to help them, because they're making that person responsible for doing it. And so, we live and breathe financial planning. We're doing it 365 days a year, and we get a day off on leap years. And with most people, it's something that they think about once or twice a year, not really more often than that. And so if an advisor, if a planner doesn't bring this into that conversation, then they might not necessarily know. They might not have that. So that the FCA asking the question, do you want your finances to take into account sustainability and ethics and so on? When asked the question, people may well say, yes, absolutely, I want that to be part of it. But if they're not being asked that question, or they're not having that conversation in a way which has neutral language, or has a framing which was, oh yeah, you don't want any of that sustainability nonsense, do you? If that's the kind of language that people are using, yes, they're telling their clients that it's there, but they're not giving them the opportunity to choose whether or not that is how they want to do things. So I think as a professional body, we have that responsibility to give the public, the clients of members of the PFS, that information that, yes, this is possible, that you can take into account sustainability in the way that you manage your money, and that it can be taken into account in the way that we model your financial future.
Yeah, and increasingly, it's not just a case of you can. There are certain situations where you must legally. So sometimes when advisors give advice, they're acting as a fiduciary, and that means they are bound by fiduciary duty. Now, fiduciary duty says that you must take into account financially material factors. And so if the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries have told us it's a financially material factor, and we are not weighing that in the decision making, how you respond to that financially material factor, well, that's where you need to exercise your discretion and understand the risks. But if you're not weighing it, then you're not making a legally compliant decision. Now, we as advisors, sometimes we have fiduciary duties directly ourselves to our clients. Sometimes we're advising clients that have onward fiduciary duties, and there's a different role there, but it comes back to the same thing, that we must have in order to weigh the risk, we must have understood the risk, or in order to advise somebody to weigh the risk, we must have given them necessary information. And that comes from case law. It also comes from statute as well. The Trustee Act, Section 5, I think it is, off the top of my head. You'll be able to put a voiceover on this recording to quote the right section, or a little bit of script. We must obtain proper advice. A trustee must obtain proper advice. What is proper advice? Proper advice is from a professional, or somebody who has the skills of a professional if they're doing it themselves. A professional would surely listen to the risk profession that's telling us it's a financially material effect. So that we now know these things, that the risk profession have given us easy to use tools and saying it's financially material, that has some legal obligations. Now, at some point, that's going to get tested through the courts. And that's going to be part of the paradigm shift. So that's very focused on investment and fiduciary duty. But that will feed back into, because if you're weighing these risks from an investment perspective, and you're describing on our current trajectory severe extreme climate risk by 2050, that highlights the logical flaw in your financial plan if that's not built into the assumptions. So I think the legal shift will be quite important in moving and shifting the paradigm in financial planning. So we might as well try and get ahead of the game.
And if nothing else, that's got to be a key function of the PFS and CIIs, to support members through that shift and avoid it becoming a legal problem, and actually be something where we're supported through it, and that we can impact our clients to get better outcomes from it. Well, we've run out of time, but we could carry on talking about this for some hours, or I'm looking forward to spending some hours reading your full research, which you sent me a while back. I have started reading it, but it is not a short bedtime read, so I'm making time for it. So thank you both very much for your time today and your insights, as well as your ongoing input to leading the profession's approach on sustainability. And for our listeners, we've talked about a number of different places you can go for more on this. But if I can recommend a starting point would be the PFS Sustainability Hub, which you can find at the snappy URL of thepfs.org/about us, that's about -us, /initiatives /sustainable-finance. I say that with a smirk on my face. This is not a snappy one. I will have it written on the show notes. So do look out for the Sustainability Hub, where we will be posting links to various insights, guidance, and other support materials. But thank you again very much for your time both today, Alan.
Thank you very much, Ian.
And Seb.
Thank you for having me along.
Thank you.